Hi, this is Tim Brown. Today we're going to talk about a really important subject. This is one that I talk about in my top 10 presentation as well, and this is really the number one of them. And that is helping your customers evaluate risk. So in this session, what we're going to talk about is shifting the conversation from security to risk, and then the components that make up risk, and how you can measure risk, and a simple model to really evaluate risk for your customers and for your client. So, why risk? Really, there's four components to risk, right? There's a risk that the business faces, and that's really a constant, right? And you have to think about what that business risk is, and then essentially you're going to apply modifiers to that risk for what people you have in place, what processes you have in place, what technology you have in place. We're going to cover all of these in the coming slides. But one of the things to think about is, why are we doing risk? Why not just talk about security? People consider security a binary, right? They really do consider when you say, I am secure or I'm not secure. And that's a terrible thing to think about when you're in the security business, even though we call it the security business. What we have to think about is risk, because risk is a constantly changing thing, but risk is a measurable thing. Risk isn't a binary. It's not a 0 or 1. It's how much risk do I face? Do I face more risk today than I faced yesterday? How much risk am I willing to take, right? Am I taking higher risk than what I'm comfortable with? Am I taking lower risk than what I'm comfortable with? And when I say lower risk, the ultimate goal is not to have, the minimal risk possible. It's the minimal risk that you can afford and that your clients can afford. So it's important to think of risk on a sliding scale. And you want to have appropriate risk for the appropriate customer in the appropriate segment. Right? So it's not saying that you want zero risk all the time. So it's not like security being a 0 or 1. It's saying, yep, I'm willing to accept this level of risk because the company is at this stage. I'm willing to accept this level of risk because I don't have these crown jewels to protect. So when you think about risk and not security, you can really have a much more actionable conversation with your clients. And when you go in and talk to a client and say, yep, I'd like to talk about risk. I'd like to talk about where you are with risk. I'd like to talk about what the risk you face. And I'd like to talk about how we mitigate that risk for you, as opposed to let's talk about security and how secure I'm going to make you. So really shift that conversation over to a risk conversation. And by doing that, you're addressing their business needs and you're addressing the needs of that client in context and in language that they can understand, as opposed to context and language that's so focused on security geek speak that they can't really understand what you're talking about. So think about risk and think about it in a different way, and that's one of the critical things. So let's talk about the business and what risk makes up a business. So why does a business, face different levels of risk? A lot of different categories make up what that risk they face are. And it's important when you're thinking about risk to take different perspectives. What you need to do is think of the business from an adversary perspective. Think about, hey, why would I want this data? Why would I want this information? What would I do with this information if I had it? Is this information that's easily sellable? Is this information easily monetizable? Is this information something that somebody or information or access that somebody else would pay me for? All of those things really build up saying, yeah, this business is either at a low, medium, or high risk target, right? And their associated risk really says how much protection you want to give for each one of them. So what makes up low, medium, and high risk? And I made these risk categories fairly simple, right? So there's some really good but really complicated or more complicated risk enablement strategies, and they really are complete. They're very good. They just take a long time to figure out, a long time to process, a lot of data to collect. So I know low, medium, and high are kind of simple, but I think they fit the things that we're trying to accomplish. And going back to what we're trying to accomplish, right? What we're trying to say is that, hey, Mr. Customer, you fit into this bucket. Therefore, we need to apply this level of people, process, and technology to minimize the amount of risk that you face. So I don't need categorization of 100 different things. I'm not trying to get that fine-grained. But I do need to know, hey, Mr. Customer, you're in a low-risk category, you're in a medium-risk category, you're in a high-risk category. So let's look at that, right? So what's considered low risk, right? Low risk is really those customers that are a target of opportunity. And when I mean a target of opportunity, they don't have anything specific that a bad guy or an adversary would want. They have a limited amount of data, right? They have a limited number of partners. They have a limited footprint. All financial processing is outsourced, right? So, the reason for a adversary to pick on them or to target them is pretty minimal, right? So when you're talking to the clients and the customers, think about it, ask them, talk to them, understand, hey, so, what kind of data do you have? Who do you do business with? What information do you have that somebody would think of is valuable? And you need to be a little bit aware of what information would be valuable to help understand that. We'll talk about a few examples as we go along. But really, when you think about it, they're a target of opportunity. Now, I use that term often, right? But a target of opportunity is somebody who will simply get scanned from the outside, they will be discovered, or they will get phished with a general phishing attack, and they will get compromised. And so those opportunities are simply the opportunities and threats that exist everywhere. A network gets scanned every day, every second, every minute of the day. Phishing attempts happen every second, every minute of the day. They're not targeted against anyone. They're simply attacks that are broad, that just simply go across, the whole environment, looking for people to answer a phishing mail, looking for those to have vulnerable systems in place, looking for those with default passwords. So these attacks are prevalent everywhere, and even the low-risk companies need to be appropriately protected and protected at least at the basic kind of good hygiene level that we had talked about before, right? So that, they have basic coverage so that they will not be a victim of a target of opportunity or a drive-by, right? So that means that they should have systems patched. They should have, antivirus installed. They should have, their default passwords changed. They should limit the amount of administrative access. All of those things go into protecting at that low risk. So the next one is medium risk. What falls into medium risk? Now, medium risk is they have a potential for a targeted attack. So they have some attractive data. They have some attractive partners. They have a footprint and data size that's small in scope, but they're a target because of the data or the access that they have. So even small companies can have access to very sensitive data. Some aren't as regulated as others, but they have access to sensitive data. So if you take law firms, right? So the legal industry collects a lot of data about people. They keep a lot of information about cases. They keep a lot of information and personal information that could be utilized to both do identity theft, fraud, those types of things. So when you look at that small law office probably faces medium risk. Not necessarily regulatory driven, but they have enough data to be at risk. Depending on a school system, a small school could face medium risk. They're definitely above low risk, right? Because they have student data. And, pre-credit youth are one of the, most attractive targets from an identity theft perspective. because you can essentially establish credit in their name before they are of essentially legal age, so they don't see it until they become legal and are starting to ask for credit, right? So, and a number of people end up having credit before they're really supposed to have credit, because there's enough information in the student's records to poses them and to assume their identity. And sometimes you assume the identities and you don't use it till later, right? But you can collect enough information that it's both sellable on the black market from cyber criminals, as well as then usable in today or in the future. So that's an example of someone that's potential for a targeted attack. Let's look at high risk now. So who fits in the high risk? Nation state or organized crime target. So they have enough money, they have enough assets or enough data that makes them a target for others. So examples are financial services companies, people with healthcare data, people with a great deal of personal data or sensitive IP. So anybody working on sensitive IP, anybody especially in like power and energy, right? So power and energy is absolutely a place where it is getting attacked by nation states. So that type of information. Financial services companies, always. Insurance companies, sometimes. Real estate companies, they have a lot of data that flows back and forth, and they're also in the middle of financial transactions. So when those systems have either access to sensitive data that can be, if compromised, could be a very good target, and if compromised can be lucrative, right, and make an adversary a good deal of money or provide a good deal of control, those are our high-risk companies. When we look at nation states, what are they after? They're after control. They're after access to systems. They're after access to critical infrastructure. So when you look at those, it's like, okay, well, who's in that business and who has those accesses that we need to protect at a different level. So when you look at your companies and those companies and your clients, look and see where they fit in these set of categories. If they're a low-risk company, it's okay, right? They're low risk, so you apply a certain level of remediation to them, a certain level of protection to them that keeps them at an effective level for a low-risk company. Medium risk, same idea. High risk, same idea. As you go up the scale, you need to put more, people, process, and technology associated with those clients to get them to the right level of protection for them. So this is really the starting point, and it's a starting point to figure out, okay, so now what do I do? All right, I've got my client. I'm starting to look at them, starting to understand what level of risk that they face. Now let me look and see if I can add on some additional remediation factors to be able to modify the risk that someone's facing. So let's start. So what are the remediation factors? I kind of gave a hint. They go to people, process, and technology, right? Each one of those can be a modifier to the risk that a client faces or a customer faces. So people associated with the business. So why people? That's one of the key modifiers we're looking at risk. Compromised accounts and compromised users and people that have access to too much data are often the root cause of a successful exploit or a successful attack. So often, phishing attacks are one of the most effective ways to enter into an organization. And a computer is not susceptible to a phishing attack, right? A person is susceptible to a phishing attack. So the way in which you manage identities, the way in which you understand who has access to what, the way in which you manage administrative accounts, all of those go into how much risk you face. Because once again, even the most sophisticated attacks go after phishing attacks as one of their base models. And that's one of the things that's really kind of important to understand, that even the nation states don't go after, unless they need to, sophisticated 0 days, right? They'll social engineer a user, they'll get access to that user, and then they move sideways in the organization, gaining access rights as they go. So it's so important to pay attention to people and manage people well. So the way in which you manage people is you make sure that you've closed that attack aperture. So people only have access to what they need to have. They don't have too much access. Administrative access isn't shared. Administrative access is controlled. People have access to do their job, but no access for additional things. Multi-factor authentication is in place wherever possible so that you know the user truly is the user on the other side of that wire, right? As opposed to simply a username and password protecting everything. So things like multi-factor are becoming much more available. And for Microsoft 365, it's called conditional access. Again, you're putting extra conditions on top of authentication, which says, okay, maybe my username and password have been compromised, but they can't access my systems because I have that conditional access. They would have to steal my cell phone, or they would have to circumvent my SMS, or they would need to do some other more advanced models to be able to get through my systems and get access to the data that I have stored. Now, low-risk environments, I think, again, same rules apply. If you can stop those drive-bys, which is phishing in this case, from doing damage to your accounts, that helps you enough, right? In the high-risk environments, you probably want to have MFA turned on or multi-factor authentication turned on in different places. So people are an extremely important factor. And this goes for you as well as an MSP, right? It's really important that you understand what your techs have access to. How much access do they have? Do they need access to all the clients all the time? Do they have appropriate authentication and password management in place to make sure that they don't have too much access? So people is an important modifier to risk. The next modifier, process. So processes are important, and they help you measure the maturity of an organization. So either it's an organization you're coming into and an organization you're looking at and saying, okay, I'm going to help you protect yourself. I'm going to help measure the risks that you face. So we've talked about people. So how's your people management? Do you know who's hired? Do you know who's fired? Do you know how much access do they have? Do you have a good process in place to manage things, right? So process is the next piece that's important. Do you have an onboarding process, a termination process, a modification process? So when you look at a company, you look to evaluate risk, what you want to see is what processes they have in place that just make them a little bit more mature or not mature at all, right? So the way that you can break that down is a couple of different ways. So organizational security, right? Do they have change management, supplier and vendor relationships? Do they have some processes managing how they manage the security for the supplier and vendors? Do they audit and log things and audit and log access, audit and log exceptions? There's a process in place for antivirus malware protection. Do they do backups, right? Do they have system backups? And do they have, again, processes in place for not just backups, but recovery, right? Do you have network security and processes around network security? Do you have data protection, vulnerability management, patch management? And each of these is not just a process, it's a program in many ways, right? So a good vulnerability and patch management program, which many of you are involved in, you know better than anyone that it's really a program. It's not just, turn it on, let it go. It's watching it. It's managing it. It's saying, okay, well, I've got to fix these things. I've got to get patches installed on the system. Data protection, same idea. You guys are doing a lot of these, but it's also a process of testing. It's a program of making sure that you're not just doing backups, but the backups work. So each one of these components is really a very important part of the overall program. Asset management, right? When we look at a company, do they know what their assets are? Do they know where those assets are and the importance of them, right? So when you look at your RMM, can you define the assets they have? Can you understand which ones are test systems versus which ones are production systems? Can you put a value on those assets? Do you know which ones are their payment terminal assets? Do you know which ones are their PCI assets? So understanding where the assets are and understanding each of the places that they go is another sign of maturity. A good process in place can sometimes circumvent, not necessarily technology, right? People plus process sometimes overweighs some of the technology in some cases. Physical and environmental security, enough said there. Access controls, right? So this fits with some of the identity and the people side, right? But do you have roles in place that limit access for certain people to have certain access? Do you only allow access to your administrative systems for those who need access, right? Do you have appropriate authentication and authorization in place? Or is it mixed? Do you have some set of applications that are open, other applications that are more closed? So this is where you really do need to just interview and talk to the clients that you have and understand what they have in place from an access control process. Incident management, also important. What do you do when something happens? Whether that something happens is a pipe breaking in the organization and you end up having a disaster, or the case of a ransomware, right? Do you have written down processes and procedures to help mitigate risk? Because that's what these do. This is, again, one of the components that mitigates risk. So you start off risk with the overall company, and then we have mitigating factors. And process people can be a really good mitigating factor if you manage them well. Process managed well is also a great mitigating factor. So business continuity, disaster recovery, data protection. So when you look at a good example of the processes that are in place, a great example is to look at, SolarWinds. If you look at SolarWinds MSP's security statement, it's public. It says, hey, this is what we do to protect your data. This is what we do to ensure security in a lot of different areas. If you look at each one of these sections that we just talked about, they're highlighted in our public security statement. So from a company perspective, if you're managing or helping a client, you really should have somebody with a mature process would have these statements in place and have these policies and procedures in place. As an MSP, it's also very important that you think about having these in place, right? Because just like a company like us, you want to see our level of maturity. So you want to see that we have public policy and public statements and public privacy policies, those types of things. You're going to want to have, your customers are looking at that same thing for you, right? So they're looking for you to have these statements in place, just like, you should be, when assessing risk, looking at your customers having these in place as well. So, what's next? Technology. So, again, we're back to the company has a base value of risk, and then our modifiers to risk are people, modifiers to risk are process, and modifier risk to technology. Again, if you have no people management and you're allowing everybody to get access to everything, then guess what? Your people management is low, and will be a modifier to the risks that the company faces. Process the same way. Process can either be a positive or negative modifier to our overall risk calculation. So when we look at technology, technology can be a fantastic modifier, right? Technology can allow us to, modify risk down to, very little, right? Or technology, in the wrong hands can modify our risk to be high, right? So when we look at questions to evaluate cyber hygiene, and, I talked about good cyber hygiene, right? And some of the things to look at for cyber hygiene is, AV, antivirus on all endpoints and all system patched regularly, right? Is the environment regularly scanned for vulnerabilities and those vulnerability patched? Is strong backup program in place? Is the company prepared for a physical or cyber disaster? Are email and spam managed? Are identities managed and access controlled? Is the network appropriately segmented and web access controlled and monitored? Is threat monitoring in place and is the environment being monitored? Are configurations audited and default passwords changed? Right? If you're doing all of those things and doing those things well, you're in a pretty good shape from a hygiene perspective. And when I look at hygiene, if you look at some of the kind of the stats, a large majority of exploits that have occurred and successful exploits, just look at the newspaper and magazines, right? They'll tell you that those successful exploits are those, a majority of them are because of poor cyber hygiene. People haven't been patching. People haven't had a good endpoint protection in place. They haven't had backups in place. So if you do good cyber hygiene well, you in most cases won't be a victim for a drive-by. You won't be a victim of somebody just taking you as a target of opportunity. So a low-risk environment plus good cyber hygiene really does equal acceptable protection. It says, yep, I'm in a low-risk environment. I've done all of these things. I do them well. So when somebody just hunts me, right? So somebody looks along my network and says, hey, I'm running these systems. Okay, well, they've got everything patched. Okay, fantastic. Not a target. Oh, somebody got phished, right? So an individual got phished. How much damage can that individual do, right? If the company is acting in a good cyber hygiene model, any individual being compromised will not be able to do a great deal of harm. Right? They'll be able to say, oops, that person, was susceptible to a ransomware attack. Okay, so their machine was encrypted. All right, so the machine was encrypted. Could they touch anything else? Well, no, they had to use multi-factor auth to get somewhere, or their credentials were protected and strong enough so they couldn't get anywhere. So in general, a low-risk environment plus good cyber hygiene really does give you acceptable protection. But when you look for a medium risk and a high risk environment, good cyber hygiene is a great starting point, right? But it's really not the end goal, right? Because those medium and high risk environments simply need more than cyber hygiene to really reduce that risk. So you need to apply additional technology. You need to be doing more monitoring. You need to be proactive in your security. You need to be utilizing additional technology and additional processes and people in order to really circumvent the risks that company faces. So in some cases, that means that you need to be monitoring 7/24. That means in some cases that you need to utilize SOC services or partner for SOC services. And partnering for SOC services or an MSSP isn't a bad thing to do for high and medium risk companies, right? Because they need that extra level of monitoring than what a general MSP may want to provide. So think about technology as ways to reduce risk, but it doesn't eliminate risk, right? Put the technology in place, but still need the people and process to be there doing the right thing in order to really reduce risk. So other things, when we look at technology, some of the questions that you should ask, like how are the crown jewels protected? Right? We've talked about crown jewels in the past a little bit, but crown jewels are those things that are the most important to your business. that, if affected, would be both very beneficial to the adversary, so something that can make them a lot of money, but also do a lot of harm to your environment. I talk to a lot of healthcare companies. One of their major crown jewels is their patient, right? Patient care is top of mind for everyone, right? So that's one thing that should not suffer and always puts up as a crown jewel. Maybe not their finance systems as much, but those patients are one of the most important, right? So when you think about the crown jewels, you want to be able to say, yep, out of my environment, these things are the things that matter the most. These things are the things that I'm going to protect the most. These things that I'm going to talk about at the board meeting. These things I'm going to talk about at my client. So it's very hard to say, is an environment secure? Is an environment have acceptable risk if it's very large, right? But if you take that very large environment and say, are my 20 crown jewels at an acceptable level of risk, you can answer that appropriately, right? You can answer that in a way that says, yep, here's where our focus is. Here are the things that we consider crown jewels. And yes, I believe that these are at an appropriate level of protection. As opposed to, well, I've got an entire company to look at. The entire company is at different levels of risk, and I can't really say whether we're at high risk or low risk. So important to think about that. Always reduce the attack aperture so that access is limited wherever possible. And think about if an attack is successful, can it be contained? And you want to model that and say, all right, if, even internally, as an MSP, if one of your techs is compromised, how much damage can they do? Think about what you would do to, reduce that attack aperture and reduce the amount of damage either an individual or system being compromised would do. Is there additional technology in place to classify data, protect against unknown threats, integrated with threat intelligence, monitoring detailed events and incidents? And that's also important to, in some instances, hunt for that threat, hunt for the threat actors, hunt for the compromised machines, and really be, very proactive. And very proactive is really when we start looking at the high risk and medium risk environments, where we do want to threat hunt. We do want to be proactively both monitoring and proactively looking throughout the environment saying, okay, where might the bad guys be hiding and what might they be doing within the environment? So when you think about the whole subject here of risk, again, we start off with the base set of risks from the company and what actions they play and what activities the company does and what space the company is. And we put them into a baseline, and then we apply people, process, and technology around the outside, with the company at the center point. And each of those really adjusts the risks. So let's take a look at a model. All right, now, a basic model for risk measurement. We first classify the company or the business into low, medium, or high risk profile, based on the things we talked in the first page, right? Just high level, it's not going to be a huge mistake if you put them in the wrong bucket, right? Maybe everybody's going to fall in medium, right? Then rate the level of maturity for people, process, and technology, right? And the level of maturity can just be on a 1 to 5 scale, with a 1 being nothing, 2 being minimal, 3 being sufficient, 4 being advanced, 5 being exceptional, right? So you're going to rate the level of maturity for people, process, and technology. So low-risk companies, optimal range is 2 to 3. Medium-risk companies, optimal range is 3 to 4. And high-risk companies, optimal range is 4 to 5. So you then score those companies. And when you look at that, in some cases, you're going to get a low-risk company that has, very good people management, very solid people, or maybe they just have a very few people, so they don't face risk on people. Process is a little light, but their technology is good. They have good cyber hygiene fitting in there. So they're at about the right level, right? They should not have super technology, and they shouldn't go overboard and spend too much money. They shouldn't go under, so they should be in the right place. Medium risk company, the same idea. They should be at an appropriate level for the risks they face. And then the high-risk company is going to need more maturity on people, more maturity on process, and more maturity on technology. So just another quick little example here. So a low-risk company, a car wash, one with good cyber hygiene and one with poor cyber hygiene. So if you look at that, right, so current maturity on people would be 2, current process is a 1, current technology is a 2. That gives them about a 2 point, I guess we're lower than a 2.5, which is ideal, right? So we'd like to see them have better process. We'd like to see them have better people and manage their people well, and a little better on technology. So we want them to really get up a little bit higher on these to meet the optimal range. And the optimal range, the optimal range is just an optimal range for a company within that low risk or medium risk or high risk segment. So when we look at that, how we decide where they are is essentially looking at the 3 factors, and the current maturity and the optimal level. And each one of these graphs you can draw for a medium company or a high company. It's going to fit the same type of model. The important thing is to get a sense of where they fit. And where they fit is something that you can explain to your clients and say, companies like yours should really fit here. They should look like this. They should have a good process. So you're a medical company with access to medical records. Medical records, as we know, are a target for fraud and a target for identity theft. So they're easy to sell on the black market. So how do you protect them? Do you have processes in place? Do you have people that are trained? Do you have people with appropriate access to the system? How do you rate yourself on people, process, and technology? So I can see you going into that medical facility, talking to the folks there, understanding, okay, so how do I gain access to the systems? What do you do when people join? What do you do when people leave? What technologies do you have in place to protect the data? Oh, what kind of processes do you have in place to meet your regulatory requirements around HIPAA and other things? So, and then with that, you say, okay, here's how you look compared to the industry, right? And when you look at that, you say, okay, you're rated about here. And you really should be a little bit higher on people, you should be a little bit higher on process, or you should be a little bit higher on technology. In some cases, you're going to walk into an organization and they're just doing fantastic in one place and not so great in others, right? You're going to say, wow, you've got fantastic technology, but people are still in the system that have been terminated 2 years ago, right? So your people is like 0. You have terrible adjustment on people. But this chart essentially gives you an open door to have a conversation with the client. And it's not about security, right? It's about risk and the risks that they face. Since you are a company in this level of risk category, since you have these level of modifiers, here's what I can do to help you, right? Here's how I can help you through this process. Mature your model so you're spending enough, not spending too much, and you're getting appropriate protection for the environment in which you live. So I know this is a simple model. There's a real lot of detailed risk modeling examples out there. CERT gives a good one. ISACA does a good risk modeling. NIST has some great material around risk modeling. SANS is fantastic. The FAIR Institute is kind of developing into kind of one of the de facto standards for detailed risk modeling. So, if you have clients that come across and say, okay, well, I'd like a more detailed risk analysis. I'd like to have more information around risk analysis, and I'd like to go deeper than the basic model, then go to one of these resources and look at the resources and pull out the data. If this is enough, at least it's a starting point, right? And it's a starting point for you to kind of stop talking about security as a binary, start talking about risk with the client and the business risks that they face, and tell them, hey, this is where you face. This is the business risk that you face, and here's how you can improve. We improve on process, we improve on people, we improve on technology, we lessen your overall business risk, and we make you at an acceptable level for the classification of your company. It takes a conversation from am I secure to how much risk do I face? And that's the overall goal, is to get the company or the customer down to an acceptable level of risk, and not too much, not too little. So that's the big points here. So I want to thank you for your time today. And I'm glad I was hopefully able to, shed a little bit of light on how to measure risk within the environment and how to explain risk in a hopefully consumable fashion for your clients. So everybody have a great day, and thank you for listening.